Thank you very much for that exciting lecture. I have a few follow-up questions, and I want to start by touching upon something you mentioned about limits. Limits were a big idea at the beginning in the 1970s, and later they had been criticized and it almost went out of fashion. It became a rather regressive thing to talk about limits. But it is beginning to come back in some ways, and the idea that we might be reaching a brick wall in terms of economic growth at the global level. I wonder, is it time to put the idea of some sort of like a frontier to growth, a limit to growth idea back into our debates?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I think limits now would be very much influenced by things like digital communication, about the way that information is processed. So it wouldn't just be limits in physical capacity, which is really what the limits to growth discussion was about. But I think limits are very relevant, and we can see it in specific areas like conservation, for example, wildlife and so on. But I think what unsettled the limits to growth question were a number of things. One was the energy pricing, but the other one really was that I think what happened was that the knowledge that climate change was going to be a major driver of development, that climate change, as it were, was more important than most other single processes. That alters the question, because people felt that it wasn't scarcity that was the problem, it was plenty. You know, we were consuming too much, it was surplus, it was buying too much, it was asking too much of the environment because of not because of the limits the environment constrained us, but how much we were spending, how much more we were consuming. And the whole idea of carbon emissions as an important element in this would have been unknown really, or very little known in the 1980s. So the argument shifted that way. But I think your point is well taken. I think in a way, perhaps the other thing is the metaphor of limits is one that people can work with. You know, as I said in the lecture, in the Second World War, people were very aware of limits in Europe generally, probably in other countries in wartime situations, because they simply couldn't get imports, because there was no way of getting the food they needed or the materials they needed. You had to reuse paper because there wasn't any paper available. And the same with energy. So the idea of limits can be extremely useful in galvanizing people, I think.
Okay. Linked to this, and I think it connects nicely to the Second World War. The Second World War, as you said in the lecture, galvanized societal change and changes in people's behavior and attitudes. Do we need an external shock like that to achieve another dramatic turn in the way we relate to each other or relate to nature itself? Do we need a big ecological crisis that will actually finally push people to move from more gradual reform into more dramatic change?
I think the problem there, maybe we do need such a crisis. The last slide was the Planet of the Apes, the last scene. Maybe we do need a very dramatic change, but how will it come about? If it comes about as a result of mass famine or flooding or some natural disaster, then can we bear to live the consequences? And would the right lessons be learned? Would it be too late to learn the lessons? So the kind of ecological imperative argument is quite a difficult one, really. I mean, we can't wait for nature to require us to do the changing. So I think in a precautionary view that we have to do things in advance of that. But there is an argument, going along with what you say, there is a view that some people have that you need an authoritarian state in order to be effective environmentally. You know, it's a very unfashionable idea, but one of the most ecologically minded governments in the 20th century Europe was the Nazis. I mean, that shows the very, I'm saying that being provocative, but other people, Anna Bramwell and people have talked about it. What I'm trying to suggest is that you can be very ecologically minded in some areas, not be very, very humane or at all liberal in others. So it may be that we do, how it'll come about, I don't know, but it may be that in terms of policy, it requires either very sudden change that meant we had to behave differently, or much more likely, the possession of a kind of ecological mandate. I mean, rather like something like the Handmaid's Tale, you know, which has been televised recently, where obviously it's reproduction which is the galvanizing factor. So because the society can't reproduce, women's roles and men's roles are shifted so that it can enable its own reproduction. Now, if were there to be a revolution on ecological principles, it might be successful. It might be more successful. What form it would take, I don't know. It might prevent people from acquiring more white goods, more fridges and freezers, or four-wheel drive cars, or I don't know how. Not easy to see. But there may be some fundamentalist challenge around the corner which would bring that about, because otherwise it is a difficult one. I don't think the ecological imperative, I don't think we can rely on nature to actually provide the warnings that are already there. You know, the question is whether you get to the point where it forces us to change our behavior is a moot point.
The signs are not very good. I mean,
no,
Hurricane Katrina in the US, and the most recent hurricane, there's another one heading there right now. And
the signs, it's the bigger sequential questions, the drying up of large continental areas. I mean, much of Australia is probably just not manageable in post-climate change. It's so dry. It's true of parts of Asia and Africa. So all the kind of perturbation, you know, the floods and the dryness, the desertification of much of the globe, these things are there, and they're large-scale processes, so I take them very seriously. The difficulty, too, is how far people discount their own behavior, say, well, I can't make any difference to this, so I'll just go on doing what I do. And I think people are divided about that. I mean, I'd like to see a lead given by politicians and government, a much stronger lead towards sustainable development, you know, towards thinking about development as only development if it was truly sustainable. You know, if it was zero carbon, if it was reused materials, if it asked questions about things like, are we going to get titanium from Chile instead of the carbon from the Near East? What does that mean for the Chilean economy? What does it mean for the rest of us who are dependent on those materials for mobile phones and so on?
In your talk, you mentioned, you expressed some hope that big data and digital technologies might play a role in bringing about the transformation. Do you think that would be the way to keep governments accountable? I mean, how do you see the link between society and state? Do you see?
Well, I think that could be used. I mean, the moment algorithms are used largely to predict behavior in fields of consumption or consumption-linked behavior, services, I think your point, one could conceive at least of a possibility of saying to governments, we know what the implications of this are because we can predict things happening. We can predict that opening up a new shopping mall will have this effect, or that introducing new kinds of technology will have this effect, or doing away with existing sustainable practices will have this effect. So I think it was really a question, it wasn't a solution, but I think, yes, as you put it, I think getting governments to be held more accountable. The political process through which that kind of algorithmic politics is really translated into everyday life and back into politics hasn't really begun, I think. That could be important.
But there's of course the risk that big data could be used for authoritarian ends that are not ecologically sensible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it could also get hijacked by the logic of capitalist development to greenwash or to hide away the bits that get in the way of economic growth. Ultimately, I guess the question is, do you see, and going back to the is hope irrational question, do you see possibility of radical transformation within global capitalist development, regardless of the tools we use? Can capitalism be reformed, or do we need to look at local alternatives, food sovereignty, buen vivir in Latin America, that challenge the fundamentals of the global economy?
Well, I think in the long run, capitalism can't be reformed. The question is, in the long run, capitalism may not exist in the form we recognize it today anyway. That would be my hope. I think things can be done in the interim, you know, to make the world better. I think it's worth looking at carbon outcomes, at embodied carbon, at issues around the way we use resources between generations, the implications for different generations. So I think there's a case for doing something rather than nothing. But in terms in the longer term, the capitalism that we recognize today, I don't think can be reformed along sustainable lines, no, personally. will we recognize what takes its place? That's the thing.
That's the question. Well, on that note, I think thank you very much once again.
No, it's been great to be here, and I've really enjoyed the conference
Yep, thank you.
and the discussion.